I'm tired. Didn't get enough sleep last night. Just a hint of tired energy here this morning. I feel it. Except for Emily and Joella. Joella must have gone downstairs. This month and next until Easter, I am focusing on some of the key decisions that Jesus made in his life that kind of defined who he was and that led, I think, inevitably to his crucifixion. And all the while, as I'm talking about these over the weeks, thinking about the kind of decisions that we make in our lives that define who we are. Last week I talked about his baptism at the hands of John the Baptist. And today I want to talk about the temptation story of Jesus. That's found in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Mark has just a couple sentences that say Jesus went out in the wilderness and was tempted by the devil, and that was it in that Mark. And then Matthew and Luke kind of expand on that, fill in the details. And I want to read from Matthew. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But Jesus answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and placed him on a pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against the stone." But Jesus said to him, "Again it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor, and said to him, "All of these I will give you if you fall down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only God." And then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on Jesus. So after Jesus is baptized, he heads out into the wilderness. And this is kind of this transition point of a major, where there's a major change in his life. He goes into the wilderness and he fasts for 40 days where he is tempted by Satan in the wilderness. Now, I guess the first thing I want to say about this passage is that the 40-day piece, when you hear this piece, and then when those who, in ancient times would have heard this story about 40 days in the wilderness, the bells would have been going off. 40 days, 40 days. Referring to 40 is a biblical number. What it means is when something in the Bible says 40 years or 40 days, it means a long time. It doesn't mean literally 40 days or 40 years. But immediately, this story of the temptation of Jesus calls to mind the time of the people of Israel when they're in the wilderness for 40 years. And while they're in the wilderness, they are tempted again and again and tried and have this period of preparation before they are ready to go into the promised land. And so this story of the temptation of Jesus is calling to mind directly what happened to the people of Israel and making the connection between the time of Jesus, the temptation of Jesus, and the temptation of those people. This connects Jesus with his people in that 40 days. And the same kind of temptations, the temptation about being famished, and the temptation about power, and the temptation about who you will worship. It's exact same temptations that they faced in the wilderness, the people of Israel. So there's that connection in this story. I grew up hearing this story in church as a young person. And usually on this particular Sunday of the year, because this is the beginning of Lent in the Christian calendar, and this is often read, the story of the temptation of Jesus is read in the first Sunday of Lent in Christian churches. And I grew up listening to this story, and I have to say that I never really understood what this story was about. I never got the significance of the going into the wilderness and the fasting for 40 days. You know, we didn't fast as a part of our religious tradition, and I think one time when I was a teenager, our youth group did a one-night fast, and we had pizza waiting at the end. And, you know, it was, I'm sure we were hungry, but it was not a significant fasting event. And it wasn't until I, really got into seminary and began to read the scholarship around these stories, and in particular with this story, the connection that was made by cultural anthropologists. The biblical scholars were drawing on the work of cultural anthropologists who were talking about vision quests in ancient cultures. And I suspect that many of us are familiar with the term vision quest, and particularly around Native American traditions, where many Native American traditions, young people, as they are approaching adulthood, are sent out to the wilderness to have a vision quest, which helps define who they are as adults. Well, cultural anthropologists talk about vision quests and when they study ancient cultures, and talk about how many ancient cultures have these same kind of experiences where when people are young and approaching adulthood, or when people are making major changes in their life for whatever reason, they go off on these vision quests. And almost always in these traditions, the vision quest involves going out into the wilderness and being alone in the wilderness, and then using some kind of spiritual discipline that helps them attain a different state of consciousness. And fasting is one of the common practices. Because what happens, in particular after fasting, what happens when you fast for a long period of time? The body chemistry changes, the chemistry in your mind changes, and what you get is you get non-ordinary states of consciousness, visions, dreams, hallucinations. And that's what's being described here for Jesus, going out in a kind of a vision quest. Fasting and participating in this kind of ancient ritual where he fasts long enough until he has these visions. In traditional cultures, a vision quest is usually some kind of a rite of passage, usually an entrance into adulthood. In these cultures, including the culture of Jesus, the vision quest, when it is used, is a necessary journey that every single person in the culture needs to experience. It's a solitary journey, meaning that every person has to go out on their own, and the vision quest that comes to them is unique to every individual. But this is the important part of that. It's an individual vision quest, but it's a community ritual. In order to find one's identity in the community, everyone in the community has to leave the community and go out on their own and separate from family and community. But then you don't go out and you don't leave and never come back. You come back as an adult, now with a vision of how your life fits into and will fit into the rest of the community. And that's what Jesus is pictured as doing here. At a key transitional moment in his life, he heads out into the wilderness and he fasts for an extended period of time until he begins to have visions. And I guess this is one of the parts I missed growing up hearing this story. That as it's described in this story, Jesus is not in his ordinary state of mind. I mean, I don't know. I think the vision that I had when I listened to these stories was that Jesus goes into the wilderness and he has this intellectual battle with Satan, where Satan comes and tests him, and Jesus fends him off. You know, they quote scriptures to each other. And so but what Jesus is in his normal state of mind. That's not what's described here. What's described here is that Jesus goes and he fasts until he has visions and hallucinations. And the vision and hallucination that comes to him is about Satan appearing to him. Now, just a word about Satan. I don't want to take too much time to talk about Satan today. Matter of fact, I don't want to take much time to talk about Satan at all. But I do want to say that the Satan in this story is not quite the Satan that we often think about when we hear that word bandied about today. If you read the Old Testament, in almost all of the Old Testament, Satan was actually part of the counsel of God. Satan was an angel, or actually up in heaven with God as part of the counsel of God. And Satan's function in the counsel of God was to be the one who was the tester or the tempter to test the true character of humans. I mean, think, for instance, about the story of Adam and Eve. The story of Adam and Eve in the garden, and it says that Satan comes to them and tempts them. Now, in the Christian tradition, that story became the story of the fall of humanity, where original sin came in. And Satan is, in that understanding, an evil thing. But in traditional Jewish understanding, there's nothing evil about what happens here. Satan comes to Adam and Eve and tests them as humans. And in the traditional understanding, what happens here is a necessary fall from grace because they're growing up. And of course, they will take from the tree of knowledge and eat because that's what you do when you grow up. And you will suddenly know things as an adult, and you will be a different person. You will no longer be in a state of childlike grace. And Satan, in that story, is not a bad character. He's the tester. It's the same with Job. I think Job has Satan come down and test Job. So Satan is not a bad character in much of the Old Testament. However, in the time of Jesus, before and after, this was changing some, because what happens to Judaism is that Judaism comes into contact with some dualistic religions where there is a force of evil and a force of good, and there's this cosmic battle that's going on all the time between the force of evil and the force of good. And in that interpretation, Satan is cosmic evil. In this story where Satan comes to Jesus, we're somewhere in between there. But Satan is not the way we think of Satan in traditional and contemporary Christian usage. So Jesus encounters Satan, who tempts him with the same kinds of temptations which the people of Israel were tempted with. And the test is, this is the test for Jesus in this description. It's, how will I use my power? Will I use my power to serve, or will I use my power to lord over people? Will I trust that God will provide with me what I need, wherever that happens to take me in my journey? Or will I claim my own power and use it to protect myself so that I don't have to experience what actually might be in my future? That's the test. Now let me ask a question that I always ask when I read these stories. This is a question I was asking when I was a young person sitting there, and the preacher would read these stories, and I would sit there and listen, and I would say, did this really happen? Did Jesus really get tempted by Satan or have this temptation vision in the wilderness? Most biblical scholars think that the content of this temptation narrative probably came from the early Christian tradition. But it's quite possible that Jesus might have gone out on a vision quest. And that memory lingered. That after he was baptized, or after he got to this point in his life where he's ready to do his own ministry, that the first thing he did was he went out in the wilderness, as many people in his ancient culture did, and had a vision quest before he came back and began his ministry. I want to close though, by framing this story in a slightly different way. I want to talk about this story in terms of roles and rules, R-O-L-E-S and R-U-L-E-S. Roles and rules and calling. We are all born with a set of roles, R-O-L-E-S, and rules that set out the basic parameters of who we are and how we are supposed to act and interact with each other. We have many roles. I'm a first child. From the time I was born and as I grew up, and I have siblings who are second and third and then a final child. There are certain rules that go with being one of those children. I'm a parent, I'm a grandparent now, I'm a minister, I'm a husband. You, and every one of us has inherited a whole set of expectations about what we do with our life. We have many roles to fill in our lives. And from the moment we are born and we begin to crawl and then walk, we begin to fill in some of those roles, and as we grow and gain responsibilities more and more, we take on more and more roles. And there's more and more expectations about who we are and what we will be like. We also have rules. The rules are the cultural expectations that we grow up with, in the culture that we grow up in. I mean, for instance, if you grow up in our culture, you will spend 12 to 15 years of your life in school, maybe more, before you begin to be considered an adult. You don't get to be considered adult until you have gone through this educational process. It's a part of our culture. And so when do you get to be an adult? I mean, the earliest you get to be considered to be an adult is 18. And for many people, we don't get to be considered an adult until we're 25 or 30 or older. And in our culture, actually, that's often considered to be okay. It's not always okay with parents, but it's considered to be okay in our culture. In Jesus' time, and in much of history, this was not so. As soon as a male was old enough to work with his hands, he was apprenticed to learn a craft, or if he was lucky, or he was a slave, and he began working with his hands in some other fashion. And he was an adult young. As soon as a woman was able to bear children, she was married off to begin being a mother. Adulthood came much earlier. I was just reading a New York Times article early this morning, about Iran and the death penalty. And many children are executed in Iran. And the article was talking about the fact that in that Islamic culture, a young girl is an adult, considered legally an adult at 9 years old. And a young boy is considered to be legally an adult at 15 years old. And so if a child, from my perspective, older than that, does some crime, they can be arrested, and in that culture, many of them are just put to death, as they put many people to death for a variety of different things. And so that's an extreme example that's still in existence in our time of different community rules, social expectations that we grow up with. In Jesus' case, he was born with an identity in his family. Tradition says that his parent was a carpenter. He had brothers and sisters and a mother. And he was also born into a cultural story, the story of the people of Israel, and their long history and relationship with God. So thinking about rules and rules, in the traditional understanding of the Vision Quest, a person goes out, and they go out beyond the borders of their culture. That's the point, to get away. Out into the wilderness. Out where all the voices of family and society and tradition can be at least temporarily left behind, where you can leave behind the rules and the roles. And there, listen for a truer voice, a deeper voice, an inner voice, to speak to us about who you really are and what is really possible in your life. To understand that you have grown up with rules and you have grown up with rules, but now the question is, what is your calling? What is your particular calling from God, from inside yourself? And this is the purpose of the Vision Quest: to be tested, to dream, to discern, to find some clarity of purpose, to get a sense finally that I have these rules, but do I know what my calling in life is? Do I know what my unique gifts and skills, how they can be matched with my own passion and then the needs of the community that I'm a part of? And this is what Jesus did. He went out in the wilderness to discern his calling so that he could come back and live out that calling. And I close with the question. In our culture, where is our vision quest? For our young people who grow up with their rules, and they have lots of them, where is that moment where they are encouraged by our community to go out and have a vision quest, to have an opportunity to discern what is their own calling? And not only for young people, but where are those times in our life, are they there, opportunities where we see the need, feel the need, and follow the need to get away in some form or another and be able to discern where we are at in our life and what is our calling? What is God calling us to be and do right now? So that's my questions for you to think about. Where, in a community like this, where are our opportunities for vision quests, for those transitional moments where we invite people, encourage people to go out and figure out what's happening in their lives and what they are called to do? Something to think about. Thank you.